Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes Why Bob is a Sponge Who Wears Square Pants. So I'm sure if you have children, you are familiar with this character we see on the screen. Even if you're not a parent, I think everybody is familiar with who we know to be Spongebob SquarePants. And as you can see here on the image, Bob is a yellow sponge and he wears square pants. He lives in the sea, in specifically a house that is a pineapple. So this entire storyline that this character, who's a cartoon, I think this cartoon still runs on Nickelodeon, but his entire journey being a sponge is under the sea. So with the help of our real all-seeing eye or our real oracle, let's dig into decoding who Spongebob is to start out with. So let's take an image of this character, Spongebob SquarePants, and start out by laying a image of the constellation of Orion next to it. And as we've seen in the previous piece that we took a look at this image of Orion, and we were decoding the Kabbalah Tree of Life, the Magician from the Tarot, and the Statue of Liberty, we see once again that our old friend Orion is showing up again in this piece. And the first thing I want to point out is that the reason Spongebob is a sponge is that he is in fact encoding for the constellation of Orion once again. And the reason he's a sponge is because, as we've seen in so many pieces at this point, Orion is a sponge himself, absorbing character after character, going back to ancient tales all the way up through the modern stories that we're decoding, including this very well-known recent cartoon, SpongeBob. So as you can see here, SpongeBob wears square pants, just like the constellation of Orion wears square pants too, right? And in this image, note even the particular arm positions that the animators chose. SpongeBob here is pictured with one arm up and one arm out to the side, just like the constellation of Orion you can find with one arm up, reaching even higher above his head, and the other arm more straight out, holding his bow. The other thing I want to point out before we move on is that SpongeBob is also always drawn in the same costume, right? Including that red necktie. And we can see how that is even encoding the sword star area in the constellation of Orion, or as we've also looked at in a previous piece, this also encodes for Orion's phallus. All right, so let's take a look here with the help of what I call the real all-seeing eye, or the real oracle, by queuing up a screenshot from Stellarium, a free online program you can find for yourself to verify everything that I'm going to show you. And just to quickly orient everybody, if this is the first time you've seen one of our videos, what I call the real all-seeing eye, or the real oracle, this very special place in the sky, is found, in this case, in this screenshot that I've queued up here. We're looking from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective. The reason we're doing so as we're decoding the SpongeBob story is because SpongeBob is in the quote-unquote American culture, right? So from what would be America's viewing perspective is how we want to view the sky. So we've queued things up in Stellarium for a screenshot showing you what's going on what we commonly call the summer solstice. So this year, that corresponds with the date commonly called June 21st of 2020. And at high noon is what you're looking at. The reason is because high noon here is when the sun reaches its zenith, or the highest point in the sky that it reaches all day. And on the summer solstice, it's the highest zenith that the sun will reach in the sky all year. So this is a very common starting point for many ancient and even modern tales, like the SpongeBob story is here. So to quickly orient everybody, if you're facing due south, that north-south meridian line is the green vertical line going down the middle of the image. Where that crosses the red arc of the ecliptic in the middle of the image, that red arc, you're going to pay attention to everything that's rising in the east and setting in the west along this arc of the ecliptic. And it's a very special place because it's where you find all the known zodiac constellations, the sun, the moon, and all the known planets travel along this very narrow band in the sky known as the arc of the ecliptic. So everything below that arc to the Earth's horizon is known as what I call the real all-seeing eye, or the real oracle. Now, the other thing that I want to point out before we go forward is that this special place in the sky is also known as the celestial sea. So what you'll find in this area below this red arc of the ecliptic are many constellations within this special area that are specifically relating to things you'll find in the sea or the ocean. So you'll find things like sea creatures, ships, even sea monsters. But it's important to know, especially when we're decoding this Spongebob tale, that it corresponds with what we're going to look at here in this celestial sea area. Okay, so let's start out. We already know that Spongebob himself, the main character of the story, is encoding the constellation of Orion. And he's yellow, Spongebob is, because it's telling the viewer it's encoding for the daytime or when the sun is out. Now I want to remind everybody, because we haven't talked about it in a few pieces here, but we have talked about it before in previous pieces. What we are looking at here, especially when we're looking at the stars out in the daytime, is occult science. This is what we're really getting into here, and this is what it really means, because you have to consider that obviously when the sun is out during the day, the stars are not visible. But in reality, they are still there cycling above our heads, even though they're invisible, right, during that time of the day. Or they're occulted by the light of the sun, in other words. So we are looking at these occulted by the sun, right, by the light of the sun stars, when we're looking at this particular screenshot of the sky story on Summer Solstice, and Spongebob being colored yellow tells us that's where we need to start looking at things. So plugging things in, not just our main character of Spongebob, but also the other characters that appear in the cartoon with him, are going to be relatively easy now that we know what we're looking at here. So let's jump right in, and our next character that we're going to look at is Spongebob's best friend, Patrick, who is a starfish. And we're going to plug Patrick in as the constellation of Taurus. You can see right to the west side of that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic. Now, the constellation of Taurus is known as the bull, but when you're looking at how the constellation is actually shaped in the sky story, you can see how the storytellers, following this template that all of these stories follow, might interpret the constellation, how it appears in the sky story, as more star-shaped, right? And so Patrick, being Spongebob's best friend in such close proximity to the constellation of Orion in the sky story, then makes sense. The next character we're going to take a look at is Spongebob's pet snail, Gary, who is a snail who meows like a cat, and we're going to plug Gary the snail in as the constellation of Lepus in the sky story. You can see just to the south of the constellation of Orion in the sky story. Now, Lepus is known as the hare or the rabbit these days, but you can see once again by looking at the shape of the constellation of Lepus in the sky that you can see, right, how the storytellers of the Spongebob tale could interpret how this constellation Lepus looks as snail-like. because it's in such close proximity to the constellation of Orion, then it would make sense that this is Spongebob's pet, Gary the Snail, as the constellation of Lepus. All right, so the next character we're going to decode here is going to be Mr. Krabs, and he is Spongebob's employer, and he is a pretty obvious and easy one to decode. We're going to plug Mr. Crab in as Cancer, the crab, found on the west side of the arc of the ecliptic. You can see in close proximity to Orion, but these are the characters that we're going to find all at the top of the arc of the ecliptic, specifically during the summer solstice time of year in the northern hemisphere. So the next character we're going to take a look at is Squidward. Now, even though his name is Squidward, he is not a squid but an octopus, and he is usually drawn with just 6 tentacles. And the animators, you know, you can find the information when you research this if you care to, say that the reason that he wasn't given 8 tentacles was it would have been too cumbersome in the animation. But I think it more relates to them trying to stay true to the template that they were given, in that Squidward is encoding the constellation of Gemini, which we've also looked at in several pieces prior to this one. And in this case, you can see, once again, looking at the shape the constellation Gemini makes in the sky story, how the several legs, right, of the twins, the constellation of Gemini, was interpreted by the Spongebob storytellers and creators as an octopus with 6 tentacles. The next character that we're going to take a look at, well, before we move on to our next character, I almost forgot, the constellation of Auriga, crowning this special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic. You can see how it's shaped looks very pineapple-like, right? The storytellers might interpret this as. Now, Auriga is known as the chariot these days. We've also seen it encode for a crown in several pieces as well as it relates to Orion. And this is encoding really for the same thing, because pineapples in reality, right, wear a crown on top of their heads as well. And here we can plug in the constellation of Auriga as the pineapple home that our main character, Spongebob, lives in. It would make sense, right? As you're looking at the sky story, as Auriga is just above the constellation of Orion at the summer solstice time of year. The next character we're going to take a look at is down here on close to the western horizon, and we're going to plug in the constellation of Cetus the whale to Pearl the whale in the Spongebob tale. Pearl is Mr. Krabs' daughter and friends with both Spongebob and Patrick in the story, and she is a whale in the Spongebob character, and she's obviously encoding for Cetus the whale in the celestial sea area of the sky in this sky story of summer solstice. The next character we're going to take a look at then is Plankton, this little character with 2 horns on top of his head, and we're going to plug him in as the constellation of Aries for a couple of important reasons. I think Plankton was decided by the creators of this story to be a small character, because Aries is a small constellation when you're looking at it in the sky story, and Aries is known as the ram. And although that's not obvious from the way the constellation is shaped in the sky story, the animators gave Plankton 2 horns on top of his head to encode the symbolism of Aries the ram as well. Now, another interesting thing about the Spongebob storyline is that Plankton's quote-unquote arch enemy in the story is Mr. Crab, who we've already decoded as the constellation of Cancer. Now, in the Spongebob storyline, Mr. Crab and Plankton both own restaurants that are across the street from one another. They're in competition, which is why they're quote-unquote arch enemies. But it's interesting that the creators of the Spongebob story encoded these characters in this way. As you can see from the sky story picture, the constellation of Cancer and the constellation of Aries being on opposite sides of that special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic makes sense here. Finally, our last character that we're going to decode from the SpongeBob SquarePants cast of characters is a squirrel known as Sandy Cheeks. And obviously a squirrel is not a sea creature. And so when she's in the celestial sea, she has to have air to breathe, and so she's always pictured there with a helmet on. She speaks with a southern drawl, and that's because she's from down south in Texas. So we're going to plug Sandy Cheeks into the constellation of Canis Major that you can see is just above the southern horizon of the Earth in close proximity to the constellation of Orion, or Spongebob, in this story. And as you can see how the constellation of Canis Major, or the Great Dog, is shaped, you can see how the Spongebob creators reinterpreted this into a squirrel instead of a dog for this tale. So taking a look at the sky story in conjunction with the Spongebob tale, you can see that it's not only ancient tales that are using this same template, courtesy of what I call the real all-seeing eye, or the real oracle here, but it's being used in modern day in movies, TV shows, and even in children's cartoons. This is to make sure that this knowledge is embedded in our consciousness, but kept occulted from us at the same time. We'll end things here and pick it back up in our next piece. Until then, be well.